AmandaLand.
It's the AmandaLand Ambassador of the Week. Get it on, y'all. Get it on. Get it on, y'all. Get it on. All right, y'all. Let's bring on to the stage our two guests today. We have Stephen Thrasher and Afeef Nessouri. I'm going to line us up like this. So, Stephen, you may have to shimmy over a little bit. So happy to have y'all. And Afeef, you're giving us chesticles. I love it.
I was really not trying to, but we're in Beirut and we're doing what we can to get online.
Afeef, you're in Beirut?
I'm in Beirut. Yeah, I'm reporting from Beirut right now.
So tell me what's going on.
So the south has been really damaged. People have returned. A few weeks ago, or like a week and a half ago, there was the leader of Hezbollah, his funeral, which was really intense time. And also just in general, the region, a lot of people come to Beirut to report. So it's there's been sonic booms, but for the most part, it's been much better than it was in terms of a few months ago.
Okay. And Stephen, where are you reporting from?
I'm in Athens, Greece, so I'm actually not so far away from Afeef. We're just a few hundred miles apart. And here we're coming off of a very, very long weekend. Yesterday was the beginning of this week was Clean Monday, which is the beginning of Orthodox Easter, sort of like Mardi Gras in the Christian calendar. But on Friday there was a general strike, which happened periodically here, and this was because there was a terrible train crash 2 years ago that killed 60 people, mostly students, because of neoliberal policies. And so people in Greece are very good at striking. So there was no flights landed, no boats moved, public transit was shut down, businesses were shut down. The city of 4 million people had no cars for at least the 2 miles of the inner city that I was in. And it was a combination of some pretty hardy protesting, but also families just out walking around, some carrying signs, some just enjoying taking back the public space for a day.
Are you based in the States?
I am based in Chicago, nominally. I'm on faculty of the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University, but I've been suspended over the past 8 months or so because I was trying to protect our students from being assaulted by police during the encampment last year. And I'm going back to start teaching again in about 3 weeks on April 1st. So I'm based in the United States, but I spend a fair amount of time here in Greece. I there's a really good leftist community here. There's really interesting politics around migration, kind of at the crux between the Middle East, Southern Europe, and North Africa. So it's an interesting place to be. And I get a lot of writing done because I'm so many time zones away. Nobody's bothering me from the United States when I'm here.
Touche. So Afeef and Stephen have put together 2 articles that we want to talk about today. Global HIV care thrown into chaos by Trump, as well as queer HIV positive running out of medication in Gaza. And in both of these articles, you guys are contextualizing a group of people who many don't think about, right? Because that's always what ends up happening. There are folks that fall through the cracks, fall through the fissures. It's enough for many folks to even bother thinking about any Palestinians or anybody in this part of the world, let alone those who are already marginalized in a marginalized community. So, I really give the floor to you guys in terms of why you felt like it was important to bring this conversation to the fore, how it is reflective of the greater global conversation that these folks are a part of, and really what it represents in terms of where we are, particularly as Stephen, you were saying about leftist politics. How does it fit into our consciousness when we're talking about where we want to push things?
Stephen, do you want to answer sort of the bigger questions, and then I can tell Amanda about ES?
Yeah, I'll say something very brief and then turn it over to you. I've been writing about HIV and AIDS for a long time, and I think that people who are living with HIV have so much to teach the world. I'm a gay man, and I know that I wouldn't probably be alive if not for the AIDS activism that people did in the 1980s and 1990s. And so I've written about the criminalization of HIV. My dissertation, my first book, were about a young man in the United States who was prosecuted for HIV, and how often these people are made into scapegoats. But so many of us wouldn't be alive, not just from HIV, but from COVID-19. The process for getting vaccines was really upended politically by work that AIDS activists did. And in the same way that the Combahee River Collective talks about how Black women were free, that would mean everyone else would be free, because that means all the systems of oppression would have been torn down. I feel that way about AIDS. I often think about, a world without AIDS is possible. There's medication for it, there's care for it. And so it's something that I dream and aspire to. But as long as it persists, that means all these other structures of oppression are going to be ongoing. And so I had vaguely, since October 7th in 2023, and following, and of course being very concerned about the massive loss of life. And as a journalist and journalism professor, of course, I was very, very concerned about the number of journalists being killed, which eventually topped 200 people. But I was sort of vaguely interested in what's happening with HIV in Gaza. And I had the scientific literature is very slim, even on the history before October 2023. But I was sort of curious and wanting to know, what is it like for people? Are they going to be able to get their medication? Is there anything that can be done? But I didn't have a real in. And then kind of by divine intervention and Instagram and his thirst traps and his
You see, he's already giving us a glimpse. I believe it. You don't got to convince me.
Yes, I noticed it, like the thirst traps, but I also noticed Afeef was saying these really, really amazing, interesting things about the queer Arab world and about Israel and Palestine. And so I've been following his commentary and started following his Patreon. And then one day he posted about a situation with HIV, and I reached out, and I will turn it over to you to take it from there.
Yeah, so I had been I'm a producer and a journalist, and I was working for a myriad of places. And about a year and a half ago, I decided to go on my own because I just felt like it would be impossible to really cover the region with a lot of the ways that I wanted to, which is just truthfully. And ultimately, I was talking to a lot of people in Gaza because of sources that I had from Palestine from years ago when I had been there, and from Lebanon and from Syria. And I was posting a lot about the things I knew to be true about queer life in Gaza and queer life in Palestine. And so I was kind of starting to talk to a lot of people in Gaza. And one person, a boy, or like a full-grown man. It's funny because we're like, I feel like at this point we're like families. I'm like my kid brother. But a 27-year-old got in touch with me and basically just wanted to talk about his queer life in Gaza. And after a while, he didn't really ask for any help. We just sort of talked like a journalist would. I just sort of asked questions and leaned in and just wanted to know more about him. And after a while, he told me he was HIV positive, that he had been given 3 months of medication from the Gaza Health Ministry. So surprise, surprise, he was actually given free 3 months of care, but it was running out, and it was running out fast because the medical depots were being destroyed. He was getting medication where he could, when he could. It was all very always rapidly sort of just unknowable whether something was getting destroyed. So I started to cover him, and Stephen got in touch, and we decided to really cover his story and amplify it. And a doctor got in touch and started figuring out how to get medication to him, and he got medication from another. It was really just community coming together, and still feels like it's still really hard because he's still in northern Gaza, and what's going on there is absolutely insane. There's just every excuse in the book to keep killing people is what's going on Israel's part, and one of those ways is by not letting sick people get their medication. And this person is on a walker. He's very weak. To be going around rubble in a walker is extremely hard. He couldn't evacuate south because of that. He lives with his mom and his brother, and he's just a wonderful spirit who is really, really, really reflective of the fact that even in his worst, he was still more worried about his neighbors and his family than like worrying about medication. And so he was always running out because he just wasn't trying that hard to
He
like
wasn't
help himself.
prioritizing it. Yeah.
Wasn't prioritizing himself.
And I've seen and I've written about AIDS in a lot of different contexts, but it was such a blessing to get to work with Afeef. And I still remember how he said, collaboration is the way of the future. And that's a lesson from Palestinian journalists that I think is really important right now. And I'm writing something about this now. We're seeing the kind of collapse of the White House Correspondents Association and the White House Press Corps, and they're very access journalism. They don't take a lot of risks anyway, but they failed to rally around the Associated Press when Trump was throwing them out of the Oval Office, and Palestinian journalists, I think, have really shown this beautiful model of what it means for journalism to be a community good, and that you work together. And endlessly throughout the last year and a half, you see these coalitions of journalists together. You see them, collaborating on things, or just sharing food together, trying to keep one another alive and safe. And I'll let you tell the story about how they kind of came into our story, Afeef, miraculously, recently in terms of medication. But they created this really, great model, and ES did the same thing. He was thinking very much about his community more than he was thinking about himself. And unfortunately, that's something I've seen in the different ways I've written about HIV and AIDS over the year, that there's so much stigma about it. It's hard to access medication in the first place. And HIV is a very manageable condition. It doesn't need to shorten most people's lives, but they need consistent access to that medicine. And so in the United States, some of the biggest vectors I write about in my book that create HIV and make HIV progress to AIDS, which it doesn't need to, are racism, incarceration, and homelessness. That when people don't have a safe place to live, they're not going to get a medicine that they have to take every day. And if they're incarcerated, they're more likely to become homeless. And both of these things, of course, are very much attached to Blackness and attached to racism. And so in the United States, when you look at why certain diseases persist, you zoom out, the answer inevitably is structural racism at some level, in some way. And as we found with when we not only talked to ES, but did more research about HIV in the region, when you zoom out, the problem is the occupation.
Right.
It was very, it was, and of course, the anti-Palestinian racism and colonialism. Now, there was a very acute crisis, which we're seeing right now over the past year and a half because of this current phase of the genocide. But zooming out, the problem is the occupation. People are not able to consistently get medicine. They're not able to live safely. And those are the things that make it so that a virus like this is going to transmit. And I really appreciated working with Afeef because he was able to really get in there, and talk to people about Islam and being Arab, and certain specific regional issues around homophobia, which of course there were honest things that we wrote about that happened. But it was also really beautiful seeing that the Gaza Ministry of Health is it's like a universal healthcare system, and they work very hard to get people. And people moved heaven and earth to try to get medicine. When October 7th happened, the Gaza Ministry of Health went to every person living with HIV that they could, where this was possible, and they gave them 3 months of medication because they assumed correctly that there would be interruptions. And as is true from my experience reporting on HIV around the world, those people are extremely compassionate. They're not judgmental. They're really just trying to help.
They're healthcare workers.
Yeah. And going.
But this also dispels though this constant rhetoric that gets thrown out through Hasbara that, Palestinians are homophobic and they're going to throw you over a roof or whatever. They're going to throw you off of a building, et cetera, et cetera. The effort to turn Palestinians into savages, which we all know at this point is really just a confession, is completely dispelled in your articles, right? In speaking about how this reality is existing within a community that is supporting what it needs, right? Because to me, that's what I get from the articles is that when you're saying like the occupation is the problem, the occupation would love to have you think that the Palestinian community is the problem when that's really not what's taking place here.
My takeaway, which was really, really just so validating, was how complicated society always is, and how like his mom was like there for him, and like his dad was like an ass, but like like his neighbor like helped him get medication, like what I mean. He like was it was just like very like normal, obviously, and it's like you don't have to tell me, but just putting it on paper and being able to like have people come out loud and say like, look, like this adult got help from the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry for his HIV, and then he also had people in his life save his life because he was young and didn't really have models of like healthcare to just really like understand what you do when you feel this way. And like there were people in his community and still are that help him. And I think that that's just true in the same way that in the United States, you have like people who are so conservative that don't understand are going to be really homophobic and problematic. And then you have people that just love everyone and try their best to make everyone feel good and get them health care and don't judge because that's just not what it's about. Like it's like we're just humans, so it's obvious. Like this is an obvious thing, but it's like we wrote it down, so now there's proof.
We wrote it down, so now there's proof.
Exactly.
That to me is the seed for journalism. Like that really is the root of what journalism in its best form is. Like we wrote it down, so now there's proof. As journalists, where do you feel like we are now in terms of the craft of journalism? I mean, Stephen, you're teaching this. So, how has your classroom conversation around the ethics and the practice of journalism even shifted? I mean, it's probably shifted significantly in the last year.
Well, in the classroom hasn't shifted much in the last year because I haven't been in the classroom the past
but
year.
I mean, you heading back into the classroom, so it's going.
Classroom. And I did have, what I got to. I actually felt like I spent more classroom hours last fall than normal because I had so many guest invitations at the sort of culturally high end at Cambridge University, and at the most important to me though, I was invited home to my high school where the newspaper I had started with my friends in 1994 is still running, and I got to spend time with those students. And so you can't bullshit young people, and they know what's true. They one of the reasons why the government and Hezbollah and the United States government or go after young people so much is because they are like idealistic and actually take the things that they learn about Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks or any other things and want to put it into practice. And an ongoing theme for me in my whole time as a journalism professor has been to think about objectivity and subjectivity. It's one of the things that I got suspended for is giving a speech at the encampment where I said that I don't teach objectivity. Now, that doesn't mean I teach being willy-nilly. I love how Afeef said, we wrote it down, so now there's proof. Like, I'm all for rigorous truth-telling, but that means understanding your positionality.
Yes.
And that's better for the journalism, better for the readers, better for everybody to understand where you're coming from. And I think that in terms of the shift for myself over this last year, or year and a half, it really has been kind of doubling down on that and understanding that journalism is a collective practice. And Palestinian journalists did that well. Many of them were not getting paid. They were risking their lives. Many of them gave their lives, and they were working together. And they're not competing against one another. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've seen very little solidarity in the White House press corps. And of course, they should be terrified to see the Associated Press getting thrown out because the AP still calls the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of Mexico. But this is a practice that's been a long problem. And I've been thinking a lot on the words of one of my mentors, who was named Ward Harkady. And unfortunately, I write about him at some length in my first book, The Violander Class, because he was the first person very dear to, very, very close to me who died of COVID early on in the pandemic. And thank you, in March of 2020. And I remember something Ward taught me. He said that Press conferences are usually bullshit. Once in a while, you'll get a little information, but they're mostly bullshit. And the biggest reason they are is because if you ask somebody a question and the spokesperson doesn't answer it, the next journalist should ask the same question.
Yes!
And the next journalist should ask the same question until they do it. And so they just like ignore it and go on to the thing that they're going to ask anyway. And so I feel like I've become, over this last year, both between working with Palestinian journalists and working with Afeef, just more committed that journalism is a collective practice. It doesn't matter who scoops who. The point is that, like, for the press to get the information to the public that we all need. And that, you know, and I think I've just kind of expanded my own map of the things that are acceptable for journalists that they need to do their work. So there's like tepid, very tepid. I'm not saying it's universal, but very tepid acknowledgement that, like, okay, you know, some journalists are unionized. They have to manage the own conditions of their labor for the work that they do. I've long said, if you want to practice journalism, you have to be paid fairly. You also need access to, like, housing, and you need access to clean water, and you need access to clean air. And so, like, it shouldn't be anything controversial that you want clean water, clean air, and access, to housing. But it also means that you need to make sure everyone else is staying alive in your community. And so that's something we've really seen, you know, up to and including, and I'll let you, if you want to tell the story, Afeef, talk about how ES got his medicine most recently. It felt very full circle for all these kinds of things I've been thinking through.
Yeah. I think generally speaking, media is changing. I think you're a big part of that, Amanda. Like, I think, like, generally speaking, people are very, like, disgusted with just overproduced, like, things that just are fake. And I think that, like, social media over the years, TikTok especially, I'm sure, like, just made it so that we're all kind of more aware of, like, the production element versus
the
like
gloss.
the raw, like the gloss. And I think journalism is finally catching up to, like, I think there's, like, people who are analyzers who are like, I'm gonna get on the mic and I'm just gonna be myself, and that's gonna, like, slap, because it's just like, here's this like version of commentary you can't get anywhere else because I'm just being myself. There's no that, like, you can't do that somewhere else. In journalism, it's like there's always been just this extreme pressure to be so objective that actually parts of the story are, like, not included because of one thing or another. And so it's like looking at a puzzle and having a lot of pieces, like, not in. And so the whole story, like, looks a certain way that it wouldn't necessarily look if you were, like, saying what Stephen was saying, which is, like, showing your positionality, showing, like, just showing up in a more authentic way to say, hey, this is what the balance isn't saying there's two sides. It's saying that at this point in this moment, there is a story happening, and you need to know the actual story as it is without any sort of capitalist spin on it, trying to protect sponsorship or trying to protect lobbyists or trying to protect people's opinions of what is going on if it's counter to what is making money. So what I think has happened is that we're all on Instagram or TikTok or StreamYard or Patreon doing this thing where we're just showing up and just being like, this is what I'm, like, seeing, hearing, feeling. And I think that's what I'm doing from Beirut. That's what I did from Syria. That's what I want to do from Gaza one day. And the point is just to literally be like, there is no buffer between what you're seeing on my camera and, like just what I'm seeing. You know, there's no, like, several editors. There's no, like, 76 cameras and so many different kinds of, like, bureaucratic ways, you know. And then I think that that's one great example that Stephen just brought up that I want to, like, kind of come back to, is that a doctor just saw my Instagram and he was in the story, and he basically was like, I think I can help. I think I can help this person that I was just covering ES very, like sort of abstractly and saying that there's this person that really needs help. Like, who can, like I was just saying, like, who the hell
throwing a line out.
Yeah, just throwing it. It wasn't even journalism at first, because at first it was journalism because it was just showing facts and being like, who can help? And someone just really, like, ultimately was like, I think I can. I was like, here's his, you know, like, I'm gonna talk to him, make sure that he's okay with this. Like, can you just give me credentials? You know, of course, there's a lot of background checking and stuff like that, but put them together, and that helped ES get medication. It's still helping him get medication. And the thing is that it was just, like, literally me being just showing a story on Instagram, like, and then ultimately having Stephen come on board and be like, I've seen, like, all of this stuff, or, like, show me more of this, like, show me your tapes, show me, like, stuff that you, like, have gathered, because I've been gathering and not knowing I didn't want to like make this a story per se. I wanted to know what ES needed first, and then after a while, I think it was like a conversation we had that he was like, I do think you should make it a story. I do need medication, and I think that it might help. Like after
Mm-hmm.
it was running out, and he's like, I think that it will behoove me if you, because for a while he just didn't want to have a story. Like he
Of
didn't want to make it
course.
about himself. He's just like not that type of person.
But then you're cutting off your nose to spite your face, and it's like,
Yeah,
what are we
exactly.
doing?
And that's exactly what we had to like just
You're
like kind
moving
of
through the
walk.
rubble with a walker. Like
Yeah, no,
let's
like
make
let's get you.
this a thing.
Yeah.
Well,
And
tell
so
me this.
yeah.
What makes the Intercept the place where an article like this is both articles are able to exist? Because I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like it's not like platforms are falling over themselves to highlight you know HIV AIDS, and that's
Yeah.
Like that's the answer. I think it's like the will that the editor and the trust that they had, just like literally working with us, was a positive experience, I think. And then Stephen, I mean, you might have a better answer. I just think that they had the will.
Sort of the same. I mean, I've written for a lot of publications, but I first came up at the Village Voice, RIP, and then I wrote for a long time at Gawker, RIP, and I wrote for a long time at BuzzFeed News, RIP.
RIP.
But I wrote about, through all of them, I actually have written explicitly about AIDS and sort of, in similar political molds. I liked that you said throwing out a line, because that's a metaphor I use, and I'll tell students like I have a complicated relationship with Glenn Greenwald as an idea. I don't know him personally, but with his journalism. But one of the things I'll talk about is when he got, the original, the WikiLeaks files and all this stuff. It's because he was like a very opinionated sort of columnist. And I'll tell students, like, live your values. And like, when you live your values, like that's sort of a fishing line you have out there. And so, something like the WikiLeaks could have gone to the Washington Post or New York Times or, any of these organizations that weren't really willing to do anything with it. But like, if things come to you when you live out your values. And so I had, our editor, Ben, at the Intercept had reached out to me when he had started working there, I think about a year ago, when I was writing for someone else at the time. But I really thought about like who would take on this kind of story. Yeah. And I thought that they would. I mean, they've certainly done this kind of stuff around Gaza and military stuff. And I don't think Ben would feel betrayed for saying this publicly. But he said, the Intercept actually hadn't had the greatest record with LGBTQ issues. And that was one of the reasons why he reached out to me. And they're really excited. They thought this would be a great way to address a community that they hadn't addressed a lot, but it also, which was kind of how I saw it as a feature story. I agree with Afeef that journalism can take many molds, but I thought this story could have a kind of a traditional feature mold that it could live in. And I thought that it would speak both to the explicit terror that a marginalized community was being subjected to, that was worthy of having its own, story illustrated, hopefully, so that LGBTQ organizers and organizations around the world would take an explicit interest in this issue, which I think it's started to do. But also I thought it would speak to a general terror that any reader could understand. Like, what if I couldn't get my heart medication, or I couldn't get my blood pressure medication? And I thought, and Ben, I think, really zeroed on that too. He said, it's both explicit and can have a universal takeaway. And so I think that was why we ended up there. But to me, like, you're right. Publications aren't falling over themselves. There are other places that we could have taken the story potentially, but I also, to me, like, the most important thing is knowing people who have, who share your values, whether or not they have expertise on the explicit thing. And so, yes, there's like kind of more scientific places maybe you could write about HIV, but I knew that they would share our values, and they did a really great job editing the story.
Well, that's dope, because that story your explanation could have gone a lot of directions. Like, we barely got this out. Yeah. They wanted to nitpick everything, but we stayed the course.
Well, we did push them, which I'm glad we did, from a timing perspective, because it was like it was in the last news cycle before the ceasefire, which is not to say that it's not relevant after the ceasefire, but I'm glad we pushed it, because it gives a sense of immediacy. And as we're seeing, I've seen, I can't speak for the two of you, but like a much more diffuse interest in Gaza across secondary media after the fact. So I'm glad that we got out. And also, I just want to say one of the values of Afeef's work was already doing this via Instagram, but I think that the feature helped do something very powerful, and that it helped focus people on an explicit choice that ES made, which was he could have just kind of given up on himself, but he decided to ask for help, and he decided he was worthy of asking for help. And I've gotten so many notes about this from people living with HIV around the world. I think we both have, but I've gotten some, personally through DMs saying like, that was my story. I'm living in a flavea, and I thought like, who am I to like ask for the medication? And he helps me know that I am worthy for it. And so in that way, like having a similar, with a book, but like when you have a documented writing down that's proof of what happens, that's less ephemeral than an Instagram story, then if someone could see that story in 5 years. I've written stories years ago that people say, I found this story and I saw the person you interviewed, like I saw myself in them. And so I'm really grateful both that both that ES trusted Afeef and that Afeef trusted me to get to share the story, because I think that it does speak to people living with HIV or who are like really marginalized in different circumstances. They're not, under an Israeli occupation and genocide, but they are, on another continent, yet still very marginalized. And that helps them see that they can try to save themselves and that they're worthy of it. Because that's one of the hardest things for people living with HIV. More people in some countries, more people with HIV die from suicide than from AIDS, because they're just so affected
enshrouded in shame.
Yeah.
What's the other thing that I think is really great about this, about you all coming together, is that there's several bridges that you all represent, right? So there's the bridge of generational bridge, right? That's needed to happen. There's also the bridge of like, you're an educator in a traditional space, and Afeef is out here, in the world with his chest out and doing but you're doing traditional journalism, but you're also engaging in the digital space, right? And I think that there is definitely a purity that sometimes gets in the way when it's this idea of like, there's only one way to do this thing, even though we're seeing changes and evolutions happening. I remember in the music business when people started having their studios in their crib, and it was like, you're not a real artist because you're not in the studio. And it's like, well, I don't have the hundreds of millions that y'all have, but I can still make a good song in my house. And then we saw that eventually get a little bit more sculpted with infrastructure around independence. And so my last question, and then we'll have questions from the audience. You talked a little bit about this, but in the scope of independent journalism, how I just said that, like, the music business has become a lot more ruled by independents, and we're about to see that with Hollywood, by the way, because the big business and the big studios, they're all about to crash. Where do you see that with journalism? Do you see independent journalism, even though you named like these really great spaces that have unfortunately buckled? Like, where do you see independent journalism going? Because I know there's a lot of folks that have unique, strong, authentic voices that are at places like the Post, that are at places like the Times, that are getting pushed out. And as of course, you have students who are like, where do I go in this career if I don't want to go there? Like, where do we see that trajectory happening and moving for folks who may want to live their values through journalism, but not at the behest of Jeff Bezos?
I think things are being built as we speak. I think things like Dropsite are being built, and things like, Mehdi Hassan, and different things are happening. And I think that they're actually just being sort of like tested. I think we're in this transition moment where we're like figuring out what works. Like, I have my own Patreon. Sometimes I have to deactivate because I'm crossing borders. Like right now, I would tell everybody like, literally follow my Afeefness Instagram, but it's not on right now because at this point I'm more worried about doing the journalism and then telling you guys about it when it's done, instead of being like apprehended because of the journalism that I've already done. So what I'm trying to say is that we're all thinking about this question, at least journalists like me are, and thinking, how do I get my stuff out there and get just sustain my life? Like, I don't need to be famous, and I just want to live normally and like do this because it is my heart, like soul. I can't literally do anything else. And if I tried, I would be really bad at it. And so to me right now, it's kind of like, ultimately I have my own Patreon and my own Instagram, and people do pay me, and I am starting to make more money because people are really starting to buy into the fact that I will do the thing that I will do, and it will be entertaining but also informative. And I think that's really important. Just figuring out a way to get your stuff out there and making sure that it's informative and entertaining and journalistic and true and valuable to people who are watching. And I think we're just in that moment where we're figuring out what works and what doesn't work. And it's hard.
I mean, I'm there with you.
Yeah, I know, exactly. We're just like doing our best.
I just very quickly made a little Venn diagram. So publication, like what are the publication's values and what are your values? And you want the story to always fit in this space. And sometimes that's very easy to do. Sometimes that's difficult to do. So like a story like this, I thought like it's going to fit very naturally with the Intercept. Could you do a story like this at the New York Times? Unlikely, but if you did, it would be so much work for everybody involved. There'd be so much risk. Even if you like loved your editor right above you, they're gonna have to go above 7 of them, and by the time that you're like not getting to use like we use like some very gay language. It's going off the top of my head. Oh yeah, where he said he was clocking those motherfuckers who sleep together. So it's like, and I was very lucky. Like when I wrote at the Village Voice and when I wrote for BuzzFeed News or Gawker, like I got to use that kind. So. I do actually think, I learn a lot from Afeef, and I think he has a lot more courage than I do a lot of times. Because
you were literally arrested because I was sitting here, I'm like, I saw that. Yeah.
I actually wasn't arrested, but yes, but they
well, you were detained. Wait, refresh my memory. They did put hands on you.
Yes, they beat us up.
I was going to say, I saw you.
But they retreated. So they actually didn't arrest us. And then when they tried to arrest me, I was out of the country 3 months later. And then the state of Illinois threw out the charges and said they had no basis to arrest me. So, but anyway, I think there's actually I think at some level people need jobs or they need some consistent access to income. And I feel sad for people who never got the chance that I got, which was to be like a general assignment reporter at some point. Like you're not coming up and perfecting every story you're selling, but I got sent like go to the school board meeting, like go to these sort of different things.
No, can you actually expound upon that? Because one of the things I find that so many of us are lacking is the steps. Right. Yeah. And like the actual spaces between like, I would know what I want to do. And then I'm doing it at the highest level. Yeah. Right. Like those steps in the middle, a lot of us miss. And we don't realize that those steps can also be places where you find like, oh, this actually is my sweet spot. I don't need to be the Beyonce of journalism. I'm really good at this thing right here.
Yeah. So I was a staff writer for 3 years at the Village Voice. And it was great because I did have to pitch feature stories, but I still got a paycheck every week. It's not like I had to, that I wasn't getting paid when I didn't sell the feature. And I had to go report stuff on the blog daily. And so I started getting sent to school board meetings. My first investigative feature, which to me was like one of the most fascinating stories I ever covered, was about how New York City has different schools in the same building. And in this one building, there was a school, a gifted and talented school that was almost entirely white and Asian. And there was a regular zone school that was Black and Hispanic. And the Black and Hispanic students went in the back door and the white students went in the front door.
In New York City.
In New York City. Right. And so it's like people in general understand like, okay, like a school, there'll be a rich school in Westchester and a poor school in the Bronx, and they're going to have different resources, not in the same building. Like visually, this was so stunning. Like I never would have found this, going around looking how to pitch. Like I got this because I had to go find education stories. And so I think that's a step that a lot of people miss. And I'm still thinking about how do we, kind of deal with that. But in terms of, storytelling, I think that Afeef is right. There's ways you can sort of get things out quickly. And I think that Dropsite and Zeteo are great examples because no shade to people who go out on their own. But I actually think the operations that are going out with a few people together are doing the best. Like so Hellgate in New York City and Deadspin, all the people who left Deadspin and created Defector, they all quit en masse, and then they were actually able to with all of them, put together, a combination of stories and podcasts,
So collective journalism.
Yeah. So it's collective. So it's like, it's a little better because it's not every person having to sell everything by themselves. And I think that model is starting to emerge a little bit now. But one of the reasons I really wanted to do this story with the Intercept, or with a publication of its quality, is like, we did need fact checking. We needed a legal review.
You needed those resources.
There's a certain level of journalism you can do on your own on certain topics.
Yes.
But then there are times where, like, you need scientific review, or you need a lawyer to make sure you don't end up in prison. And that, I think, but I think there's some models of, I think some of the outlets, you can either buy into that or join organizations and get some of that.
But I love that you state that, though, because, and Miss Latia had mentioned this in the chat, like, there's a difference between just like going off the cuff and saying your thoughts on something and journalism. Like, I know I get frustrated because I feel like people can't tell the difference between that. And then even with myself, they can't tell the difference when I'm like, there's a difference with me being like, this is my opinion, and me saying like, this is a thing that's really happening, and here's an expounding upon that. Like, and I mean, everybody and their mama be like, I'm a journalist these days. It's like, no, you have a TikTok. You have a TikTok and you have Wi-Fi, and so you be Googling stuff, and that's different. So we're gonna get to some questions from the people. Are y'all ready? Yeah. All right. First question. Reese Roberts, he's from London, so I always try to do it in my best London accent. Question for Dr. Thrasher. Has there been a moment in your journalistic career thus far when you have encountered a staggering ethical or moral dilemma? And if so, how did you overcome it? Fabulous question, Reese. Fabulous.
Okay. That's a great question. Two things come to mind, and also riffing on what you were just saying about, kind of the difference between journalism and stuff that isn't journalism. I wrote a story actually for the New York Times Metro Desk many, many years ago about a homeless shelter for LGBTQ youth that was being run very poorly by LGBTQ people. And I had some members of the community who did not want me to write this story because they said it's going to make gay people look bad, that we can't take care of our own safely. And that to me is like one of the differences between a journalist and, an activist, not that activists all are all like this, but like sort of someone looking out for PR for the community, because I don't want to be, the Catholic Church that takes someone abusing the kids and says, well, we're just going to take care of it ourselves. And because that's going to hurt the kids. And so for me as a journalist, I realized I was like, in that story, I'm there for the people I'm writing about, the kids. Like the gay kids deserve to have a safe place, even if they're homeless, that has safe fire code and, on all the same things they would have if they were, any other kind of children. They deserve that safety. And if that makes, us look bad, that's part of the role of journalism. Like, you still have to be accountable within your own community. And so it actually, it was fine. Like, everything which happens with this is a, the power of the New York Times. I mean, like government kicked in immediately, like all the issues got addressed immediately. But it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't written the story. And, and it doesn't matter if like the people who were running it looked bad, like they needed to
look bad. Sometimes shame is actually a very effective tool. And it's also sometimes the only tool, right? Because people, unfortunately, are very vain, and doing bad is not enough. It's like it's the same way that you get people who are more offended by being called racist than actually by doing racism. Like, oh, how dare you? Well, you just okay. Next question. Dr. Thrasher and Mr. Afeef, could you share how you came to recognize and embrace your talents for the good of the collective?
Yeah, I'll go first if you don't mind, Stephen. I think it's just about being like literally a Lebanese American. I would go back to Beirut all the time, and there were a few times when I was there that like war, like Israel just literally was bombing Beirut. And as an American kid, like that's so hard because you're just so damaged by that concept because you're both just traumatized, but then you're coming back, which was harder. And having to like explain what happened with everyone kind of saying it's your fault, more or less, and having that kind of, and then finding your people and knowing that there are other people who have experienced these kinds of things and these kinds of I guess oppressive ways of culture can be so oppressive when it's just misinformed, right? Like it's just so
Yeah.
oppressive when it's misinformed. And I would be in college or in school or even grade school. Like 9/11 happened when I was 14. So all of these things collectively made me kind of a strong advocate for what I thought was true and knew to be true in my experience of true, like the truth of the
Yes.
stories that we were talking about. And I think that it like kind of refined me to be like more and more and more honest actually out loud and not be very afraid of what people thought, to be honest. And I think that it
Mm-hmm.
allowed me to gravitate towards other people who are doing the same thing. And in my work, I have recognized and embraced the fact that finding other people with the same talents or the same ideas, the shared values that we were talking about, the idea
Yeah.
that we can work together to be more powerful, actually. Like, it's not always just about me, right? Like, I think we're so used to everything being about ourselves all the time, and it's also like it's like great to be a little selfish for sure, but it's ultimately really really hard because you eventually just only think about yourself, and that's like extremely. It's just if you're always just trying to be famous because of the journalism is going to be bad. It's just going to be not good. It's not going to be great. Like when you think about what you are interested in and you see your values in other people and you work together because the story is just so captivating and it's making you feel so meaningful and sad sometimes, happy sometimes, complicated sometimes, you lift your energy to another vibration. Like you're just like operating from another place, and it gets you to operate with other people from another place, and that kind of result is different. Like it's just a different, you're going to have a different result if you
Yeah.
really embrace your talents from a place of love, like literally, like not like selfishness or like material like gain, because that stuff will come. Like that stuff isn't not necessary. It's necessary. It just comes so in so much more of a beautiful way, I think, when you do operate from your heart. It's not easy though. We're still in a system that obviously is
I was gonna say
completely
that's
like, yeah, it's not
and people don't
foolproof.
even trust it. People be like, "You're not operating from your heart." You're like, "Yes, I am." Oh my God, you don't know my heart.
Exactly. Yeah, like I'm not going to speak on, but we're all. This is like a huge struggle bus these days for all, not maybe all of us, but many of us who are doing the right things. I think like the more you're doing the right thing, I think the harder it is to really,
Yes.
really make money because the money that is all around
Correct. You
is
have to
unethical.
decide. Like, I guess I just don't need money. Like,
Like I just need to
you
eat less or like be less.
I mean, that's what I had to do. I had to really be like, this is your last vacation of this magnitude. Like, you did it. Yay for you. But we're not going to be doing that anymore. Now you're going to sell pins. Like,
No.
that's just. But you get filled with something else. And I think there's something also really, there is a certain reality that, and you said this earlier, it's like I remember when I was coming up in hip hop and there were underground MCs who got to make a living being rappers. And they may have to work a little harder. They may have to do a little bit more traveling because they may have to go overseas, but they got to make a living loving what they do. And their living that they were making didn't allow them to have Bentleys. Like it didn't allow them to fly private, but it allowed them to feed their families, to feed themselves, to be comfortable, but also to like live in what they love, which also allowed them to feel like better humans, right? Because they weren't like denying themselves something. They weren't closeted rappers. So it was like that opened the door for me to understanding just the reality of the spectrum of things, because in the United States you really get tricked into thinking that if you're not doing everything at this high glam capitalist level, then what you're doing isn't valuable. It's also not even considered successful. And to me, like, success is I am able to live without thinking about living by what I love to do. That to me is success. And you're right, it's getting harder and harder to do that in real time. Dr. Thrasher, you want to close us out with your thoughts on this?
I was raised by three really great parents who all died. My mom, my dad, my stepmother, who all died in my 20s. So I've had a lot of time to, really think about their values. And they were all people of modest means, but they were very collective minded. They were involved in church. They would, give what they had to everyone around them. And my dad was Black and my mom was white. And so they had gone through a number of kind of explicit civil rights matters around that. But also, they were also living in a majority Mexican American community where I grew up, Oxnard, California. And they were also like doing work with migrant farm workers, and they did things that Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers did around the rights of field workers. And I got to talk to my mom, not to my dad, about being gay before he died, which I regret. But we didn't know many out gay people. They knew a couple of lesbians, but I remember explicitly they had a friend who transitioned, and their wife, and then they were two women living together after the transition. And I remember there's no conversation about pronouns or anything. It's just this person changed. This is like how we're talking about them now. And so I feel like they really set an example for me to you care about your community, but you also care about other communities. And my grandfather was a Black man who only went through the third grade. Jesse Thrasher, that died long before I was born. And then he was he worked at a predominantly white factory, but he was one of the union shop stewards in that. And he had this collective bargaining, camaraderie with his fellow workers. And so I feel like I was just really steeped to believe that whatever success I got had to be shared in community with other people.
We love it, because that's really what we talk about on this show every goddamn day. Every day. So I always give our guests the stage to leave our audience with their own messaging, their own words of wisdom, of encouragement, of shaming, whatever you feel is most effective. So I will step away and give the stage to Dr. Stephen Thrasher and Afeef Nessouli.
What do you want to say, Stephen?
Oh, wow. That's a tall order. I would say these are very difficult times in the United States, and some of us, or me, might be feeling very bruised as we go into this new era with the Trump administration. And something I've been thinking about is giving grace. I need to give more grace to myself, but also I'm seeing lots of conversations right now from either between kind of leftists and liberals who were not as worried as maybe they should have been, or even with potential Trump voters, or actual Trump voters who now might be quite alarmed at what's happening. And so I'm thinking about how we need grace for on-ramps for people to come into our fights. And I'm remembering how there are things that I write about as something of an expert now, but once upon a time I was not. And I also feel like in the experience that I had with you, writing these stories, that I've gotten to, learn a lot, and how important it is to carry on through life with an open mind and an open heart. So that's kind of what I've been thinking is really needed right now. There's a lot of fucked up shit that's happening, and a lot of work to be done, and a lot of us to do it, needed to do it. So I think we need avenues of grace to come together to do that work.
I would say that as we kind of transition in this administration, we're sort of realizing in real time what kleptocracy and extreme consumerism really brings us, which is just the most profitable things, but not necessarily the best things. And so now we're having a country move into a space where there's a bunch of really rich men without any real ties to grounded life experiences, running a country full of really diverse people. And there's going to be a lot to fear, but I think that what's more important than just what you're fearing, what I'm fearing too, is just the only message I have is to keep fighting, to keep advocating, keep going, the thing looks really bad before it can get better. And the truth is that in the Arab world, that has happened. It doesn't always seem like it from the outside going in, but a revolution happened in Syria that people were really fighting for a long time. And it still doesn't look great right now, but it looks a lot better than it did a couple of months ago. And so I think that ultimately you have to know that your gut and what you really believe in and your values are coming from a place that are likely going to help you get through this time. So commit to them and keep being loud about them. That's all I got to say.
Amen.
Thank you all so much. You can follow Stephen Thrasher at Thrasher, and you can follow Afeef. What is your at again? It's at Afeef, right?
Yeah, but it's not online right now, so just give it a couple weeks because I'm just deactivated for a reason. But I promise it's for journalism and nothing else.
Okay,
it's a good reason. I can vouch. Okay. I can vouch.
It's a good reason. Thank you all so much, and it's always great when like I'll have people on because I admire their work, but then during the interview, I'm like, I admire their person, and we have the same values and everything. I know people in the chat are like, did she do a debrief? This is exactly what she be saying every day. So thank you all so much. We appreciate you for being our ambassadors of the week here at Views from AmandaLand. And make sure to go out and get the viral underclass, The Human Toll When Inequality and Disease Collide. And make sure to go to the Intercept and read these articles, all right? Queer HIV positive and running out of medication in Gaza, as well as global HIV care thrown into chaos by Trump. I Will Be Sick and Maybe Die by Dr. Stephen Thrasher and Afeef Nessouri. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Bye. Y'all see what happens here? This is a great place. This is a great place. Look at us here at Views from AmandaLand. What a day. I enjoyed laughing and learning with you. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And tell your friends. Also, listen to the podcast. It's available everywhere pods are casted. Listen ad-free by subscribing to Patreon Amanda Seals. Come on and join the Seal Squad. Views from AmandaLand, live 10 a.m. Eastern, Monday through Wednesday, with content on Thursday and Friday at YouTube Amanda Seals TV.